Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith. They stared in horror at the ruins of Fort Auspice. The windows had fallen in, the elegant verandas had collapsed. Trees thrust through the broken roof like giant hands tearing the building apart. Roots wormed through the walls and cracked them open. The whitewash that had sparkled with crushed shells was now black with soot, where part of the building had been set on fire. "What has happened here?" whispered Adam. Rob let out a deep groan. Dropping his cane, he ran towards the building, trampling the weeds that sprouted in his grandmother's old flower beds, and in through the entrance. A termite mound was all that remained of the wooden doors that had graced the fort. He paused on the threshold. He was no stranger to carnage. He had seen the decks of a man of war after battle more times than he could count. But nothing had prepared him for this. This had been his home.
Those stirring, dramatic words are taken from Nemesis, the most recent Wilbur Smith book, wonderfully co-authored by my brilliant host, Tom Harper, she said, hoping he'll be just as complimentary about me. So, Tom, where does Nemesis fit in the great Courtney sequence, which I guess now is the longest-running family saga in basically all of literary history?
And getting longer all the time. As you say, this book came out in April of this year, 2023. And there are more to follow as well. So this is part of a project that Wilbur embarked upon before he died, in collaboration with me, to fill in the gap between Blue Horizon and When the Lion Feeds. So regular listeners of this podcast will probably know When the Lion Feeds opens in the late 1870s and introduced Sean Courtney, Garrick, and their father Waite, living in a farm in the Tugela River Flats. And then later, much later in the 90s, Wilbur went back and wrote the prequel trilogy of Birds of Prey, Monsoon, and Blue Horizon. And Blue Horizon ends in the mid-1730s with James Courtney and his son George settling in the place they call Nativity Bay, which in fact is the location of modern-day Durban, and settling down, having had many adventures getting there. And we sort of leave them happily in this sort of Edenic paradise.
That's really interesting. It had literally never struck me reading the book that Nativity Bay is Durban. But actually, that's perfect because that is actually a really strong connection with both Wilbur Smith's own family life and the Courtney's family life, and the importance of Durban in both those situations.
Yes. And so the project that Wilbur and I were working on when he died was to take this Courtney story from the mid-1730s to the mid-1870s. So that's 140 years of history, covering the entire intervening period. And the first book in that sequence was Ghostfire, which is in the 1750s. The second book was Stormtide, which is in the 1770s. And this now is Nemesis, which picks up the story another generation later. We start in the 1790s and go through to about 1807 or 1808.
Except that you start in two different places at once. So let's begin with the one that is historically furthest back, which is the 1790s, and the very dramatic scene of the beheading of Constance Courtney, as she was, witnessed, oh dear, spoiler alert, but it's right at the beginning of the book, witnessed by her son Paul. So Paul's story is going to be one of the main threads through Nemesis, but tell us a little bit more about Constance and about her son.
Yeah, so Constance is a character we first meet in Ghostfire when she's a I think, just on the cusp of being a teenage girl in Madras in India. And her father is Mansour Courtney, originally Dorian Courtney from Monsoon and from Blue Horizon. And she and her brother Theo are orphaned early on in Ghostfire, and they, through a series of misadventures, become separated. And Constance falls into the hands of the French and is taken back to France, where she makes her way through the French aristocracy with some fairly bad experiences, but through force of circumstances, forced to make herself a sort of black widow, sort of almost like an Eva Peron type figure who progressively works her way through the ranks of the French aristocracy, finding kind of more and more high status men because she needs to survive in this very unforgiving world that has been incredibly hard on her. She establishes herself at the heart of the French kind of ancien regime aristocracy. She has a son who she has great hopes of, who becomes a great naval commander, and he features in Stormtide. Spoiler alert, he's no longer around by the time we get to the opening Nemesis. But of course, the opening Nemesis is, in a sense, the ironic end to Constance's progress through the French aristocracy, because she has reached the summit. She's a friend of Marie Antoinette, she's a regular at Versailles, and then suddenly that isn't really where you want to be because the French Revolution breaks out, and she goes from this absolute star in the firmament of the French government to this hated, reviled figurehead of the Ancien Regime. And in this opening chapter, we see her, meeting the end at the guillotine that happened to let's say, these stalwarts of the French aristocracy.
Indeed, and she's being witnessed. Her death is being witnessed by her son, her young son, I suppose, teenage son at that point, Paul, and he has basically been told by her, survive at all costs. Whatever you do, just survive. Do whatever it takes to survive. And so one extraordinary thread of this book is really about his incredible ability to survive in a series of extraordinary circumstances. Tell us about the other thread, which picks up another line of the Courtneys, because by this point, the kind of family tree is kind of like a gigantic spreading oak. They're just all over the place. So there's another thread of the Courtney family who are going to occupy the other thread of the book. So tell us about them.
Yes. So this is, I guess, what I think of certainly as almost the main line of the Courtneys. So broadly, there is a line that is going to go more or less from Tom and Jim from Blue Horizon down to Waite and Sean in When the Lion Feeds. And so the descendants of Jim Courtney are really what I think of as kind of the main line of the Courtneys, because that's been the sequence of generations in the prequel trilogy that Wilbur wrote. And so we now have Rob Courtney, he's the hero of Stormtide, and he is the grandson of Jim Courtney. And Rob's son, so we're now kind of into the third or fourth generation after Wilbur's original prequel trilogy. Rob's son is called Adam Courtney. Rob has become a great admiral in the British Navy, because this is the period of the Napoleonic Wars, and he has risen from a deckhand all the way to the very heights of the Navy. Some would say second only to Nelson, some would say even greater than Nelson. And his son, Adam, who's in his early 20s, as we open this book, has followed his father's in his father's career, was born at sea, raised at sea, entered the Navy as soon as he possibly could, and is a young captain who's just been given his first command. And as we open, they are, which is early 1806, they have been sent with a fleet and an army to capture Cape Town.
So I guess the question is, who is Cape Town being taken from? And why did the British want to take it?
Well, Cape Town is being taken from the Dutch, but it's really being taken from the French. And it's worth pointing out this is actually the second time in the Napoleonic Wars the British take it, because they take it once, and then there's a peace and they give it back. And then war breaks out again and they decide they need it back again. And what's happened is in Europe, Napoleon has invaded Holland, the Netherlands, and he's abolished the Netherlands because that's the sort of thing he does. And he's created something called the Batavian Republic, which is basically a French puppet state. So they are now the colonial masters of Cape Town. And it's obviously absolutely intolerable for the British to have the base at the Cape of Good Hope controlled by Napoleon's sort of quisling government. So they decide to capture it. And they send, this is all historically true. They send a sort of an expeditionary force, army and navy. They land an army and they fight a battle called the Battle of Blauberg, where they defeat the Dutch defenders, who, it has to be said, are probably outnumbered and outgunned. And they capture Cape Town. It's not a huge engagement. It's not a massive moment in the wars, but for the British, it's absolutely essential that they control the route around the Cape of Good Hope, because obviously that is their supply route to India. One of the things that we were aiming to capture with this whole sequence of books is just how interconnected the world is, and how in this great period of expansion and trade and imperialism and exploration, that the tea that is thrown into Boston Harbor in the American Revolution has come from India, around the Cape of Good Hope via Britain, and the taxes that the British government have charged on that are helping to fund the war effort in the American Revolution and then later in the Napoleonic Wars. So the whole global economic system is up and running in this period. And the Courtneys, is this great sort of mercantile, trading, maritime family, I think are really right in the middle of it. So the British have to protect India. Of course, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, part of the reason for that is he wants to get to India because he sees that as Britain's great kind of economic base. So to cut a long story short, that's why the British are going for Cape Town, because they need to control the route to India.
And I guess the reason why you put the Courtneys into Cape Town, A, because they're kind of going to a place which I think is vaguely mentioned. They sort of built in the very first place. If you go right back to Birds of Prey, there's Courtneys who helped build the fort at Cape Town.
Yes, and I think one of the joys you mentioned at the beginning that the Courtneys is one of the longest running family saga, and that's one of the joys of working in this world, is that there are these places that become touchstones, like Egypt, but Cape Town maybe more than any other, where Francis Courtney, his blood is sort of basic somewhere in the cement of the stones holding together Cape Town Castle.
It's literally, yeah.
And he's died there. And then in this book, it's his descendants who are recapturing it from the Dutch. And there are scenes in the castle there. So that was a lovely way to be able to kind of tie things together.
And of course, it offers you as a writer the chance to do something to a Courtney early in the book, which forces another Courtney to take action. But we better not say it, because there have been so many spoilers already, but exactly who it is whose problem causes the other person's actions. But it's like a Newtonian law of literature. For every problem, there's an equal and opposite assertion. I don't know. So you have these two time threads. So you have Paul, whose timeline begins in 1794, I think. And you have Adam, whose timeline begins in 1806. So they're 12 years apart.
Yeah.
And these two timelines continue kind of in parallel. What was it that made you think? And I mean, it's a really interesting way of writing a book. And I know from having done it all myself that it can really help to have one thing bouncing off another and creating tensions and links that the reader thinks must be there between the two timelines. At the same time, it does cause both the writer and the reader kind of it's more complicated than just telling a story from A to B. So A to Z. What made you decide to do that sort of two level story?
On one level, it was trying to work out how I could write about, or how we could write about the things that we wanted to cover. And there were two things in particular that stuck out. And one was the Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1797, 1798. And the other was the British capture of Cape Town in 1806. And so some of it is just a response to the logical problems of how do you find a story that covers those very geographically different places, and also there's very that kind of span of years. But the moment you start thinking about it, you realize that there's actually, I mean, I've always loved kind of the intricate kind of puzzle box type novels, where things fit together in really not complicated ways, but intricate ways. And I, as in my previous career, I'd written a number of kind of time slip novels, sort of like, if people have read Labyrinth by Kate Moss, where there's a historic story set in the past, and then a present day story that's interacting or in dialogue with that historic story in some way, often revolving around kind of an artifact or some kind of secret that's hidden in the first story and uncovered in the second story. So I'd done a few of those, and I really loved that as a form. So having that experience, and I saw a way in which you could have these two stories that they dovetail. The end of one is almost the beginning of the other. And so that by the time you finish the first story, it explains what's happened in the second story. And that kind of gradually revealing the information in that way, I really appealed to me.
I think one of the things which I always say to people when they ask about writing is that so much creativity, it's not just kind of random imagination. It's exactly what you're talking about. It's you have a problem to solve.
Yeah.
It's, for example, how am I going to get my characters into this or that place at the right time for the thing I want to happen, and it all makes sense and it's all logical. And the other thing about the timelines is, of course, that Wilbur has sort of done this before, but in two separate books.
Yeah.
So you have River God, which culminates in the kind of creation of tombs for the Pharaoh Mamos and also for Tanis the general. And then you have the Seventh Scroll set in the present day. So, 3,500 years after the events in River God, in which present day archaeologists go in search of the things that were left behind in the previous book. And so essentially what's happened now is that both those things are happening in one book. Although one of the expectations when you have a double storyline, it's a bit like having, the man and the girl in a romance, and they kind of, they have to get together in the end, and the whole thing is, and usually the two stories in the kind of thing you're describing, as you say, one resolves the other, or they mutually resolve one another, and that actually does happen in Nemesis in the blink of an eye. I mean, all you get as the resolution is a few lines, if that. I mean, there's just probably like one sentence which goes, you go, oh, okay, wondering how that was going to happen. I mean, when you did that, was that, I can imagine sort of having a sort of quiet smirk on my face as sort of, okay, I get fooled them this time. Well, in other words, the book has a very fascinating and interesting and satisfying and also intriguing, because it makes you want to know more, kind of ending. But you don't give away the whole thing. That again must have been a deliberate choice.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're always really conscious of wanting to stay one step ahead of the reader and wanting to take the reader to surprising places. I mean, this is why people love Wilbur, right? Because you never know where the story is going to go. And the challenge, if you've got these kind of two interleaved stories, particularly ones which are reasonably close in time, is that I think the moment as a reader you start reading it, you're thinking, well, how is this going to connect? And you're going to start forming ideas about how it's going to connect and how it might link up. And so, and because in a sense where it's going to end, because the second story has already told you what the kind of end state of the first story is going to be, you have to find a way of disguising that and muddying the waters a bit, so that it's not just really, you haven't given away the ending of the first story, in the first chapter of the second story. And so, yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about how you do that in a way which is kind of dramatically satisfying, and plausible and coherent, but at the same time, the reader won't see coming as they read the 250 odd pages of Paul's story. They won't necessarily know how it's going to end, even though they will know some of the circumstances in which it will end.
And even if you think you figured out, which I think I did, kind of what the connection is, you still don't know how it's actually going to be resolved. And how it was
Yeah.
resolved took me completely by surprise.
Excellent.
I remember once being a friend of mine who was a stand-up comedian, and you would tell him the funniest joke, and he would never laugh, but he'd say, "Oh, that was a professional smile I gave you." It's like, yeah, good joke.
Yeah.
And I had a kind of professional smile, and I was like, "Oh yeah, clever, like it."
I'll take that.
But also, one of the other things that it has in Nemesis is, and I don't think this is too much of a spoil, a really, and I won't say which one it is, which name it is, but there is a Courtney in this book who is an absolute 24 carat USD approved, ocean going, weapons grade, awful, nasty baddie. I mean, a proper Wilbur Smith baddie. Bad to the bone.
Yep.
How do you set about? I mean, I suppose if you're writing a real Courtney baddie, they have to be as rotten as the good Courtneys are heroic.
Yeah.
Must have been a lot of fun though, having a Courtney who was just thoroughly bad.
Oh yeah, and I mean the old line that the devil has all the best tunes is completely true, and I'm sure you find the same. When we talk about your book, there's some pretty horrific villains in there too. Yeah, I think
they aren't Courtneys. I have villains, but no Courtney villains. There's one Courtney villain actually in an earlier book, but I haven't had the chance to really do a proper Courtney.
Yeah.
Really.
The way we approach that is very much that you take a look at the characteristics that make the Courtneys heroic. As you say, the villain has to be as villainous as the Courtney heroes are heroic, but I think they have to be villainous in quite specific ways as well. So they have to be villainous in ways which are almost the mirror of the or sort of the dark version, like the upside down version of the Courtney traits. So the Courtneys are very single minded, but at what point does single mindedness become ruthlessness? The Courtneys are always amassing tremendous treasures, but okay, the way you do that is important, and actually the point at which you then start amassing power and treasure for its own sake, again, tips you over into villainy. And the Courtneys have this charisma, this tremendous charisma, and again and I think Hugo, our antagonist, has that too, and of course the other thing which I think is really important, he has daddy issues, because and this is kind of one of the real themes of the book, is that which is, I mean, it's not the theme of this book, it's the theme of the vast majority, I think, of Wilbur's books, because it's such a timeless, universal theme. And going right back to When the Lion Feeds, it's all about, children and their parents, and particularly fathers and sons. So in the same way that When the Lion Feeds is Sean really trying to come to terms with how do you become a man in the shadow of a man's man like Wade Courtney. So in this one, you've got Paul, who is guided by what his mother has told him about how he has to survive.
I'm trying to think. Do we even know in the book who his father was? Does he know?
His father was this French nobleman who Constance.
He does know.
Yeah, he knows who his father was, but his father, he's very much a mummy's boy.
Yes, Paul. But he doesn't know that Constance Courtney, what that actually kind of means. The fact that she was.
Yeah, he's as far as he knows, she's French. He only has a vague inkling of her kind of Courtney history. So his fate is kind of governed by his relationship with his mother. Adam he's got the super heroic father, as I say, the sort of sailor who is more Nelson than Nelson, and so it's and he's chosen to follow him into the same profession. So it's how does that weigh on him as he tries to make his way in the world. And then Hugo, the antagonist, also has had an incredibly powerful high achieving father. And there's a scene actually where you see the statue of his father in the middle of Calcutta,
Yes.
because he's been one of the great kind of conquerors of India. And again,
But also about it, we sort of learn, isn't he? I mean, he's not. It's the rotten side of the family, because isn't he a bit of a rotten egg too?
yes, yeah, that whole branch. I mean, it all goes back ultimately to Monsoon, where you've got the two brothers, Tom and Guy, twin brothers, I think, and Tom is the sort of noble, virtuous one, and Guy is the weak-willed one who progressively, whose flaws gradually manifest themselves more and more until he becomes the outright villain of Blue Horizon. And so they're descended from Guy's, Hugo's branch of the family descended from Guy's side, and Adam's descend from Tom's side. And this is like the duality that descends right the way through the family tree.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about Nemesis is that or one of the things is that you place Paul at one point. Paul, I think I can say this. He makes a very interesting journey at one point. We're going to come to Egypt in a second, but he makes a journey which is very, very iconically Wilbur Smithian, because he makes the journey down the Nile, past the cataracts, into, I guess, Sudan and Ethiopia, as it would now be, not then.
Yeah.
And he ends up in Ethiopia, and he's forced or obliged while he's there to do something really, really, really terrible, to take on a job which kind of robs him really of any moral standing at all, and and makes him do things which are unforgivable.
Yeah.
So the things which interested me about that was the kind of peril of putting your protagonist in a situation where, as it were, unlike quotes unquote a true Courtney, they don't just they'd rather die than do such a thing. But of course, he has his mother's words: "You have to survive. You have to survive. You have to survive." And then something happens to him, which I don't think we should say what it is, but he's kind of punished for that in a way, sort of a lifelong punishment.
Yeah.
And I wondered how conscious that sense was. Well, if I've made him do these terrible things, he kind of has to pay a price for that. Or was that not a connection? I don't know. Am I reading too much into that?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I had made that connection, but you're right, it completely works. That what befalls him, that was something in the moment. This was a section that I've been working on, and it was literally one of those things where the story kind of takes over.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
And you suddenly realize that the terrible, horrific thing, that the place you really don't want to go as an author, is actually the place that you have to go. And again, if you're writing with Wilbur, you know that the more dramatic and the more outrageous and the more squirm-inducing in the reader kind of place is absolutely the place that you have to go. And I don't know if you found this, Dan.
It's interesting, actually, as you said that, the answer is yes. But also, and in fact, we'll come to that in books. That I can think of specific instances in books that I've done that with Wilbur that sort of applied. But it hadn't occurred to me until you just said it, that the particular choice you made your job as a writer much, much, much harder.
Yeah.
Insofar as one of the things that a character has to be able to do can't be done anymore, and it makes a writer's job very, very difficult. But anyway, let's get away from all this kind of giving away of the secrets and place ourselves back. And I'm going to talk about Egypt for a bit, because of course Egypt is one of the central kind of themes in all of Wilbur's work, and it goes right from River God right through to, depictions of Cairo in wartime and afterwards in the War Cry trilogy. So you've gone for a point in Egypt's history which is very, very interesting. It's the arrival of Napoleon and his forces, the young Napoleon, charismatic Napoleon. Still not yet an emperor, I don't think.
No, he's not even in control of the government. I think.
Right. He's just this brilliant superstar field marshal general.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is. I believe this is the period of the Directory where he is almost like a triumvirate that are ruling France, and he is one of three. But he is by far the most brilliant, obviously.
And he arrives in Egypt at sort of the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, the very beginning.
Yeah, 1798. Yeah,
And of course, this was in reality the period at which, for example, well, he was very interesting because he went on a military expedition, but took with him historians, archaeologists, all sorts of intellectuals, so as to record the wonders of Egypt, and really made the first serious survey of the antiquities of Egypt. And of course, during that time, the Rosetta Stone was found, which enabled the translation of hieroglyphs.
yeah.
But I mean, as you were writing it, were you kind of thinking of this as being sort of somewhat as in dialogue with other depictions of Egypt at other times within the kind of canon of Wilbur's work?
Yeah, that was very conscious, and one of the reasons I was really keen to do it. I mean, I'd read River God. I loved River God. I was always secretly hoping that they'd ring me up and ask me to work on one of the Egyptian novels as a co-writer, which they never did.
Oh, well.
But I never got that call. So this was my next best opportunity. But I was really working on this. I had a copy of River God on my desk.
That's interesting.
And there's a bit where Paul visits a temple, and as much as I could, that's the idea you should get from that is that that's the temple that Taita had built, the great funerary temple he's designed and built.
I hadn't made that connection. That's really interesting.
To create that kind of link, and then obviously, as you said, the journey he then goes on, kind of further and further and further south, is exactly the same journey, down into Ethiopia, the headwaters of the Nile. That's exactly the same journey that Taita makes in the second half of River God.
And it sort of also plays forward as well as backwards, forward towards the journey that is made in the Seventh Seal, also down into that same part of Ethiopia, which is where this terrible thing, which I don't think we can specify, happens to Paul. But reader, it's worth reading it just to find out. And what then does Nemesis? I mean, Nemesis is literally a doom-laden word.
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of Nemesis in this, actually.
Yeah.
Because it's a story whose motivation, it turns out, for both Paul and Adam is revenge.
Yeah.
They're both driven in the end, which is a very, very dark, motivating thing. In a funny sort of way, not entirely heroic, but powerful, very powerful. So which plays into the word nemesis. But what's the specific relevance of Nemesis in the context of the book?
Funny enough, when we were going through the editorial notes, one of the comments that came back from the editors was like, "Who is the Nemesis?" And which was actually it sounds, the way I say it sounds kind of like they're being pedantic and a bit thick, but actually it was a really insightful. It was the right question to ask, and it really got me thinking and sort of unlocked some things in the edit. I think there's sort of a couple of things to unpick. One is that Wilbur ends Blue Horizon with the Courtneys in situ in Nativity Bay, which is modern day Durban, nicely settled. They've got this amazing fort they've built. They're friendly with all the local people. They've really it's a happy ending. Spoiler. And then 140 years later, the Courtneys are in their farm, Thunis Kraal, but on the banks of the Tugela River, which is probably about 100 kilometers from Durban, maybe not that much. So in 140 years, the Courtneys have gone 100 kilometers. And so right from the very beginning of doing the sequence to connect those two blocks of books, we knew that there was going to have to come a point you'd have to wrench the Courtneys out of Nativity Bay and take them, quite a distance away, so that it wasn't just a matter of, 1 year they hitched up their wagons, drove for 4 days, and then settled in a farm somewhere else. That was clearly
Insufficiently epic, I think that would be for the Wilbur canons.
yeah. That was never going to cut it with Wilbur, was it? So
No, no.
and so this book was
I think the title "Nice Short Drive." Can't see that. Can't see that on a book.
yeah. Maybe eventually we'll do the alternative version, which will be a short story about a pleasant wagon drive through the sunshine.
We could do but maybe we could have in the manner of our times the nice, cozy, offence-free, all the words taken out version of Wilbur Smith's stories, which are tremendously nice stories about really kind people who don't ever harm a fly at any point. And I think it's better for the present day, don't you? There'll be a publisher who'll say that sooner or later.
Yeah, and the children skip along beside the carts and chase butterflies and pick flowers. Yeah,
exactly. Little flowers and
yes.
Hello flowers, hello trees. Yes.
This is not that book.
No, this is absolutely not that book at all.
So, in the knowledge that this was going to be, that at some point the Courtneys would have to be sort of wrenched out of Fort Auspice, which is their home. They built.
Oh boy, are they wrenched!
Oh boy, are they wrenched! And so the extract I read at the beginning is when Rob and Adam, our two naval heroes, come home, having been away fighting the Napoleonic Wars for a long time. They come home to Fort Auspice, and it's been completely destroyed, and everyone is dead. Basically, spoiler.
That's more like it. See, that's what we expect from a Wilbur Smith book. It's been completely destroyed and everybody's dead. Splendid. Good starting point.
Yeah, that's yeah. I think, and so everything in the book hinges. That's why I chose that extract to read, because everything in the book hinges on that event, in a sense, and in fact, of the whole sequence of books connecting Blue Horizon and When the Lion Feeds. That's to my mind, that's kind of the ground zero. Everything that's happened, it leads into that, and everything that happens afterwards springs from that. So we knew that this was going to be the absolute kind of crux moment of the series, and then so to come back to your question about the Nemesis, I wanted to explore the ways in which the kind of lives they lead have repercussions, and they're not always positive repercussions, and so the kind of the good line of Courtney's, Tom and Jim's line, have tremendous success, but they also make a lot of enemies along the way, and there will be moments when that comes back to bite you.
Sure.
And then of course the question is, well, what do you do about it? And what Adam decides to do about it is, I must avenge my family's honor. And you're right, vengeance is a very dark and dangerous emotion. And motivation.
Yeah, not least because it tends to be infectious. It's like the revenge continues from generation to generation, because you create a new revenge when you satisfy a first. In other words, you kill one person. It's like a sort of mafia sense of revenge that then the person who's related to the person you just killed wants to kill you.
Yeah.
And then it just carries on forever. It's like a sort of daisy chain.
Yeah,
daisy chain. And
there has been an element of that in the preceding Courtney books, where this feud that really begins with Tom and Guy in Monsoon and Blue Horizon has kind of redounded through the generations. And so, yeah, it was kind of taking that to its logical endpoint. And then once you've taken it to its logical endpoint, then you sort of, well, what happens after that? So and really looking at the kind of, and kind of taking the Courtneys to some dark places and seeing what do they do in those situations where the demands of honor really clash with the demands of humanity. And to what extent do you fight for your family against actually doing what might be right kind of morally? So it was really about exploring all of those ideas.
And it's very interesting because, well, right at the end of the book, that exploration and the kind of the thoughts we've just been discussing kind of become explicit. I mean, very economically expressed. But Adam is forced to confront the sort of, is this really such a good idea? This fact that I'm just completely, what price am I going to pay? What price to my soul, but also to my future, and to the family and everything. The book ends with what I would say is a sort of hopeful resolution for Adam, a really interesting one of those non-resolutions for Paul that makes you want to know what the resolution is subsequently going to be. At this point, I mean, do you yet have a route map in your head of how you're going to get from where those characters are now to where they have to be in whatever it is, 1879, on that farm? I mean, is it kind of is the path kind of not specific, but roughly sketched out in your mind, or are you someone for whom it's just going to, as you say, the story sometimes tells itself that over time that path will become clear, even if it isn't now?
It's a mix. So going back 5 or 6 years now, Wilbur and I had sat down and mapped out a plan for the whole sequence. And it was originally mapped out as a 3-book sequence. Sorry, it's a 5-book sequence. I think it's actually grown because the story was bigger than it looked when you jot it down in an outline. So there is a plan. I say that I'd worked on with Wilbur, and I think a lot of the broad outlines of that will follow through. But at the same time, some things happen that do just take you by surprise. And I think Paul is an example of a character. I'm sure there was a version of the outline at one point where he didn't necessarily survive the book, and actually you get to the end of the book and you realize that can't be the ending. So, for example, he's someone who didn't have a big future mapped out beyond this book, but actually I think now will come back and play a part.
Isn't that funny that some characters who you think should probably die end up living?
Yeah.
And other characters who everybody assumes are going to live, you think, nope, sorry, love, for the good of the series, you've just got to go. I mean, it's just sometimes happen like that. And you find yourself thinking, did I just do that?
Yeah.
And then people call you up and say, did you just do that? It's just seen the draft. What the actual ... But that's because things take on their own logic and characters take on their own logic. And I also think it's incredibly pretentious when people say, oh, I can hear my characters talking to me, or they just write themselves. But actually, that is what it's like. There's a point where it's almost like kind of automatic writing, where a character, you just find yourself taking a character in a particular direction because that's just the direction they have to go. And you hadn't anticipated that at all, but it becomes evident to you.
Yeah.
I'm quite curious now.
And as you said earlier, with what happens to Paul, as you're doing it, that this is going to be making your life much, much harder, because actually the economical quickest way to get to the end is to have them do something different, probably less dramatic. But as you say, I'm completely with you. I always kind of roll my eyes when authors talk about, the characters are like real people to me. But actually,
the characters are like real people to me.
Yeah, there are moments definitely where they tell you what needs to happen to them.
Yeah. And for me, those moments are the most fun bits in writing.
Yeah.
I know this is a little kind of quick author tip here, but one of the things I sometimes do if I'm stuck is I just get two characters talking to one another, and I'll just write dialogue and so often, once I've kind of got into the spirit of it, into the groove of it, once I just start heading at these two people talking to one another, no descriptions, no kind of, it's just literally like you're writing a play. It's just literally the lines.
Oh, wow.
And very, very often, one of them will say something which I had totally not anticipated, and which can either just make a single scene, you think, oh yeah, of course that's how it has to go. And sometimes, as with the thing that happens to Paul, transforms the entire book.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, I had literally not worked out what who that character really was. But once I've got them talking, it becomes obvious who they are and what their motivations are and what their, all those things that actors talk about. And again, you think, oh, that's pretentious nonsense. No, actually it matters.
Yeah.
Motivation really matters, What I'm like really matters. And for me, that's just like it's when things take flight like that. And you sort of feel it's not even you, it's just somehow, it's just coming. that that is the thing which actually makes writing kind of worthwhile.
Yeah, no, completely. Those are the real highs. And of course, I think it's worth pointing out that when Wilbur wrote his books, the books he wrote himself, the majority of them, he was never planning. So in a sense, he was being taken by surprise by his characters, presumably every day.
Oh yeah,
Because famously he didn't outline, he didn't plan, he just wrote and took him where the story took him.
he actually said to me once that he finished his work halfway through a sentence, and all he knew was how he was going to end the sentence
Yeah,
every day. So at the end of the writing day, you're halfway through the sentence, and
yeah,
come back tomorrow morning, you follow up from the word
yeah.
and that's kind of an extreme way of doing it. But I remember at the time I hadn't really started writing fiction at that point as a journalist, and I thought, oh, that's very interesting, and I actually kind of used that as a little tip when I first started writing fiction and thrillers and stuff.
Yeah.
When I think that's about all we've got time for this week, but having discussed the importance of Egypt in Wilbur's work, and indeed River Gods specifically, what better thing could we possibly do than talk about the book itself? So join us next time for the beginning of a series of shows based around River God and Egypt. And in the meantime, it's goodbye from me, Diana Thomas.
And it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.